Before the Physics Center actually got underway, I had gotten a grant from Alan Waterman at the National Science Foundation to fund a program which we called the Public Understanding of the Role of Science in Society. And that also brought a number of sciences, obviously it brought scientists, people like Harlow Shapley and so on came. And having made that contact at the National Science Foundation helped us later on, and it also led to our getting to know Shirley Silverman at ONR, who knew some of the physicists who were going to be involved in the Physics Center, and who believed in the idea. And so that was kind of the, and then we bought the ranch in 1964, and I started to withdraw out to Woody Creek.
Well, I guess the relations with the Institute were a little bit rocky from 64 on, I would say.
It was a funny time because when Walter was gone, then Pussy Bethe began to, you may want to edit this, of course, because she's become such a subject of revisionism, I would say, in the town. But Pussy reinstated or reinstituted, if I may say so, Mortimer Adler. Yeah. And Adler was very anti-Physics Center, anything basically to do with scientists being involved, or the Aspen Institute basically focused on the humanities. Then that was a lot of BS, but there it was. And so that led to getting a guy whom I had been dealing with for funding at the Ford Foundation, namely Alvin Urich, who was also known by Mrs. Cortlandt Barnes, Katrina Barnes, as Alvin P. Urine. But at any rate, that and Al Urich was a decent guy, but he didn't have a clue about what the Institute could and should do, and so gradually Adler took over the program of the executive program and pushed out the tradition that we had established by that time of having in every seminar session of the executive program one or two or three even scientists, many of whom came from Los Alamos. And that tradition started with Walter Peck himself bringing Enrico Fermi here, and I brought Gamow and Don Hughes and people like that, and George Cowan from Los Alamos, as well as Roderick Spence, and what was his name? Puck. Not Tuck. Tuck. Well, we brought Ted Puck, but we also brought Jim Tuck. Jim Tuck. Friar Tuck. Yeah, who was a real character.
Bob, you mentioned Mortimer Adler. I don't know whether you were around for our mano a mano with Mortimer.
No, I was not. I heard about it, but I wasn't.
This was a very carefully orchestrated event. The idea was to have a debate with Mortimer about
in Pepke Auditorium.
Right, about science and learning and all of these good
and
things. Ideas. And with Bob Marshak was out that summer, and he was an obvious candidate for the panel because he had started life as a philosopher. Hans Bethe was here, and I think I may have been the third person on the panel, but there were three of us against Mortimer, and Mortimer won hands down.
We thought we had him outgunned, and the guy...
Little did we know.
He was a good talker.
How did Mortimer win, David?
He just brought the crowd with him.
He
just brought the crowd with him, and he had that skill.
Yeah.
Well, he used the Socratic method, but he used it with such arrogance that it was just unbelievable.
He was like a stiletto. He really was. He just mesmerized people. I remember my parents came to visit one summer, and in those days it was easy to audit the things at the Institute. You just called over and said, my parents are here, they'd like to go. So they audited one seminar, and they were just fascinated by Mortimer. I mean, he just really knocked them in the aisles.
Well, he was a showman, there was no question. But it did affect the direction the Institute went in for a long time.
Well, until Joe Slater came in.
And
really
Joe gradually eased him out,
moved it over.
but it was not easy.
Well, it was interesting looking back in some of the archives because we started as the physics division of the Aspen Institute, and the first couple of years we were here, the annual reports from the Institute had a section on
The physics.
and then they disappeared.
Yeah.
And that was it.
Right. And it was interesting that having a physics division, they never had an appearance of any of us at a board meeting.
No.
We never met their board. Yet they wrote an annual report.
Yeah.
Bob Anderson did care about the interaction
He did.
because you remember he wanted to continue the idea that we should meet at least once during every executive seminar, or at least once or twice in the summer. And there was a classic example of that in 1966, I think it was, when he came over and led a discussion on Thucydides and the art of war. And in the audience was a young postdoc of mine named Tony Leggett.
Oh, yeah.
And Tony, as it happened, had first begun life in the classics. So he knew Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, etc., and he'd read all of Thucydides in the Greek. So Bob is cheerfully going on, and Tony was very quiet. At one point raised his hand and took issue with Bob. And Bob was going on, and Tony said, but in the Greek it says.
So we were not totally beloved, I think.
Well, no, there was actually, Shorty Pabst thought that the majority of the physicists were basically oriented toward the left. Shorty was very conservative. And I argued that no, that was not the case, that many of them were doing very, very fundamental research for the national defense at Los Alamos, and that they were very concerned. And as I said, as a matter of fact, at that time, and this goes back to my other point about this being more significant in many respects, in my view, than the Aspen Institute, that the Aspen Physics Center, I argued that many of the physicists knew more about the humanities than the humanities people themselves, that is, people in the field. And I still believe that, by the way. I still think that if one were to look at the scientists, particularly in a time of postmodernism, and when, and that goes back to a point that I brought up with George earlier on. We brought Hillary Putnam out to talk with us that, well, what if? This was before we actually, and I think the conclusion was that we were going to measurement and quantification in the social sciences. Is it possible? And is it worth doing? Is it worth pursuing? And what would the impact be from people from the physical sciences, particularly physics? And we kind of concluded that there was no there, and furthermore, that most of the funding for science at that time in the early 60s was going to physics, and therefore it made sense to focus on the field. So, but I still think that physicists as a whole have a broader sense of what, I'm not saying that they're politically any more astute than anyone else, but they do have a sense of literature, of poetry, of music, and the, quote, humanities that is, in my estimation, much deeper, much more genuine than many people who pose as, quote, humanists.
Well, things went along for a few years. I mean, we essentially went off on our own and started developing the physics program.
Yeah.
I think the next big thing was probably Fermilab.
Yeah. And that was Wilson.
Yeah, Bob Wilson had come out already just to visit and to fish. And he was out on vacation in the summer of 1967. He had just been named head of Fermilab, and his view was that Fermilab should begin with not 1 but 2 years of a summer study group, and he was wondering where to place that. He and Jane encountered my son, Jonathan, our son Jonathan, in the street, and Jonathan said, "My parents are here, why don't you come over?" So Bob and Jane and their son Randy came over, and we sat around and started talking about this. Went out to dinner, I think, at Pinocchio's, and over that hatched the plan that Bob bring the group to Aspen. There was, of course, a small problem that he was bringing a group of about 50 people at a time, 50 or 60, and we didn't have a building to house them. So we called George. George and Bob talked. Take it from there.
Well, I remember Bob was very keen on the idea that in designing the experimental equipment, he need to be in a hotbed of theory, so that that wasn't who was going to lead who, but how do we go together between theory and experiment. So he was very keen on being associated here with theorists.
Yeah, and that persisted in later design studies, and very consciously mixed up theorists and experimenters.
Yeah.
And he found, excuse me.
Well, I recall, George, that the next spring I got a call from you saying, "Do you think this is a good idea they want to go ahead with?" And I said, "Yeah, go ahead." So the building, ultimately named Hilbert Hall, was built in something like 6 weeks. It's just sort of a bare bones
I was
shell.
involved in that. But, and of course, that did not endear me to the Aspen Institute, because it meant an extension of this campus over here, another building, which we did for about, a ridiculous sum of about $20 a square foot.
Yeah.
Of course, it looked like $20 a square foot to some extent,
It was not winterized.
but it wasn't bad. It
served the purpose.
It definitely served a purpose.
It did.
And it was agreed that it was temporary for 2 years
Yeah,
or something.
we extended that temporary for what, 25 years?
25 years.
Yeah.
I'm reminded, because they always called it the NAL,
Yeah.
the
it's
Institute.
NAL.
National
And-
Accelerator.
Yeah, they couldn't get Fermilab right.
Well,
And-
that came later. The name came later,
Yeah.
but it was just the National Accelerator.
But they always called it the temporary building, and we thought we needed a defense against this word temporary. So
I think
I think I was responsible for picking a name like Hilbert. I said we
I think that
need
extended
to give it
its
a
life.
name that has some sort of endurance, like David Hilbert.
Is my recollection correct that we got the money for Hilbert Hall from Bob Wilson?
Yeah.
That came from his funds.
Yeah.
And Anderson and Beyer agreed with me, that is to
that
say,
fits, does
to
that?
do the building. And Herbert's office did the building. He had done Stranahan Hall beforehand, which was a more winterized and all-weather building.
But always had a leaky roof, because everything Herbert built had a leaky roof.
It's a Bauhaus.
Yes,
Yeah.
it was.
Had to have leaks.
George, are you the one who had the poster of Hilbert?
Yes, I found a poster of Hilbert someplace, and remember, we had it right inside. Come in the front door, there was a nice poster of David Hilbert with his old hat on.
This is a poster from the American Mathematical Society.
Okay,
Because
exactly.
Hilbert was the great mathematician at the beginning of the
Absolutely.
last century.
I thought we were indestructible when we picked a name like that. But
The Fermilab summer study was here for 2 years using the building. So that had 50 offices, well, space for 50 in it.
Right.
And we were, at the time and still later, renting houses around the neighborhood to put our overflow physicists at the physics center in. And when the Fermilab summer study was completed, then we took over that building because it gave us the space that we needed. So it was an essential step in the program in enlarging the program.
It made it possible for the Physics Center to actually expand and grow and provide reasonable space that wasn't available in the Stranahan building.
It also increased our awareness in the community at large. That is, as a result of that, essentially everybody who was anyone in particle theory was here during one of those summers, and they loved it. And most of them came back. Many of them are still coming.
Well, I think it helped us with the funding community also, that we had played a significant visible role in designing a very important national facility.
Now, when I arrived in '65, I'm the newcomer of this group, housing was pretty expensive. It cost, I believe, $500 to rent a house for the summer. And you had, as I recall, a choice of houses, because I know we were first put into a little house in town, which was a little tiny, but Sally had thought, gee, a family with 2 young kids shouldn't be very far out of town. So that didn't work, and you then found us the guest house on the of the Urics on that what I forget what it's called, between 5th and 6th Street over there. That large.
What was that, David?
The Urics were living in a main house.
Oh,
that
they had
was
the Stoller
They
house.
had
the Stollard
The
house.
Stollard house.
We were in,
The Stollard
so we
house.
were in the
Historic
guest house
Society.
of the Stollard house, but you were able to get that on very short notice. And at that time, how was the funding of the Institute? Because you didn't, as I recall, we didn't get any housing subsidies. We didn't need them, but somebody had to pay for Sally and the other secretaries.
That was largely out of the funds that we got from NSF and from ONR,
It was ONR,
And,
Sloan, NSF,
Sloan, and
and it was my view at that time that we were covering our actual out-of-expense cost to the Institute.
One further remark I'd like to put in on the Fermilab summer study. The Fermilab people liked it so much, liked being here and having the theorists around and so on, that for many years afterwards, the program advisory committee, which really set the experimental program at Fermilab, came out here every summer, and the Physics Center was a formal or informal host depending on the year. And they would be here for a week or 10 days actually designing the experimental program, and they had people to talk to.
yeah.
Their attitude, which is actually the attitude I think of most of our participants, is that it's very nice to get away from your home institution so you don't have the usual distractions and you can concentrate on the physics. And that really, over the years, was a very important element for Fermilab. They made a mistake ultimately and started holding their committee meetings at home, and it hasn't gone so as well.
I think early on we realized that it was a good idea to try to get more in the way of NSF funding.
Yeah.
So I think the year was 1966, and we invited one of the rotating theorists at NSF to come out, look at us, and consider how they could fund us. He happened to be an old friend of Susie's and mine named Arnie Feingold, who had been a colleague at Pennsylvania. Arnie came out for about 3 days, and as part of that, we that means Susie and me and Margaret Gelman, Murray was away, drove him up to Maroon Bells. And in the course of that trip, I think we blew our chances of getting funded. Susie and I didn't blow it, Margaret blew it. Arnie is driving up, looking at how gorgeous it is, and saying, well, how does anybody get any work done here? And Margaret, cheerfully sitting next to him in the back seat, piped up, oh, people don't work a lot here. We enjoy the out of doors. We enjoy nature. It took then another 3 years, I think, before we really got our foot in the door with NSF and had to be really led by the hand by Marcel Barden, who had come out with the Fermilab people. And he explained to me one afternoon at great length what had to go into a proposal. how we did it, what we could do, what we couldn't do, and so forth. And I guess we got our funding, but maybe a year later in 1970 or so?
No, it was, the first actual grant was 73.
It took that long.
It took that long. In the intervening time, we were getting to be in pretty bad straits. I looked up some numbers just out of curiosity, and in 1970 we had a budget of $26,000, and we had a deficit, and there was a contribution from George in there, which took care of things.
Needmore did.
And I at a meeting, high energy physics meeting at Rochester, I talked to the NSF person who was the successor to Wayne Gruner, whom we dealt with earlier. And he said, yeah, if you're about to go under, I will put some money in, but try elsewhere first, because it didn't want to get out on a limb and support a bunch of theorists off in the mountains. And Marcel came, it must have been the summer of 71. He actually came, and I remember two of us talking to him out on the lawn here, and we got the advice and put in a proposal, and the next year got a grant for $33,000, which was enormous.
Yeah. Did we get some money from Eugene Fubini at DOD? Because I went to see him at DOD because of Bob McNamara having been on my board, on the Aspen Institute board.
I think that might have been earlier.
It was earlier. It was
I
in
think, yeah.
about 1964 or 63.
I remember
it was
that-
before I
remember
left.
Fubini, yeah.
The year we got separated from the Institute, that is, we were getting a modest subsidy from the Institute, maybe $5,000 or something, but the year we got separated.
I don't think the Institute.
No, the Institute did not subsidize us, and would not.
And would not.
But
And would not subsidize us.
But at one moment, you were really fairly desperate about whether we could continue. It would have been 66 or 67. And, beating the bushes, going back to Sloan, going to ONR, and sort of trying to use our network to see if we could get a little bit of support. And I think you got 10,000 or something like that.
didn't IBM come in at around that time?
Wiener came in early from IBM with, I remember, 25.
Right. Because Fubini had been at IBM. of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah.
And I think that was what his role was, more than DOD making a contribution.
I don't really remember a lot of those. I forget those bets. That's like,
Did he kind of want to?
how was it when you had that sinus operation? I don't remember.
One of the key things in this was that the Institute had gotten sufficiently tired of us that they told us in '68, go away, go become an independent corporation. And George got that all set up. We indeed became an independent corporation. Then we could ask for money in our own name.
Yeah.
And that made a big difference, I think.
Huge difference.
Yeah. The year we had the first NSF grant was 1972, and that was also the year we got the first NASA grant, as far as I can determine.
That's because we'd started the astrophysics program, I guess, in '71. That came out of the first workshop that was organized here, which was on pulsars. The year was '69. I organized it, checked with George and Randy to see if we had space, and I started making phone calls in July for a 2-week workshop in August, and it's a measure of how easy it was to do things. People came, Peter Goldreich came, Hans Bethe was already here, Chris Pethick came over from Copenhagen, and we had a marvelous time for 2 weeks talking about pulsars, and that was the start of a really intensive summer effort here on neutron stars. and it was the start of interacting with the astrophysics community. Sterling Colgate was here, and out of that, we hatched the plan to try to have astrophysics be part of the regular summer program.
During this period when we didn't have very much money, we needed funds for the library. Well, Sloan had given us some money for the library very early, and then there were a period of years when we simply couldn't afford to buy any books. And I actually went back to Sloan later, and Larkin Fahrenholt was the person I was dealing with. He was very sympathetic, and had put in a modest proposal, something like $6,000, to allow us to get the library collection up to date. And ultimately, they decided they had gone out of the business of funding facilities. So that didn't work, but just then NSF came in, and library was one of the legitimate things that we could spend money on.
I think Fermilab probably helped us with the library.
Probably.
Fermilab, Bob Wilson was certainly our cash cow in terms of,
For a while.
and we were an extraordinarily inexpensive cash cow at that time. I mean, he could afford to put up our Hilbert Hall, house people, be sure we had all the right books in the library and so forth, for probably a fifth of what it would have cost to do it anywhere else in the country.
By the way, I took Bob Wilson, this was many years later, and paid him back a little bit for his early contribution by getting him on a very large rainbow on our fishing club on the Colorado River. I took Bob and George Cowan there, and his smile was just unbelievable. He was happy.
You know, Bob, you were talking about scientists as humanists. Bob Wilson is probably as good an example as they come, because he was not just an amateur sculptor, he was a professional. He was really good at it and very imaginative. And when he designed Fermilab, he had a hand in every part of the architecture, and that was a sculptural and artistic tribute to Bob as well as a scientific one.
Yeah, he was quite a terrific guy. Well, the understanding that originally we had, I think George will bear this out, is that this land was made available to the Physics Center, and in a sense, became the Physics Center's property, though we never had any transfer of deeds. However, that was my understanding. I think that was also Anderson's understanding. I think it was even Herbert Bayer's understanding. But then Al Urick challenged that, I think, at some point, and then I think Joe Slater, to a certain extent, forgot, or conveniently forgot. Is that correct, George?
Well, up until we separated, became a nonprofit, it was not a question.
Yeah.
We paid for the building on the Institute's land and operated as a physics division of the Institute. When we separated, we became our own nonprofit with no property, because we didn't own the buildings were on the Institute land, therefore they belonged to the Institute, and the land belonged to the Institute. And we began at that time, basically the question is security. How do we know we can run next year if we don't own the building? And it was our perpetual question to the Institute about, will you give us at least a lease? A lease. And I think they ended up saying, we promise we'll give you 90 days notice before we kick you out. It was about the best we could do.
Didn't we get at one point
Yes.
$1 a year lease?
No.
No.
We never got
never
a
got
lease. And in fact, I'll never forget when, I think early September morning, I come into work, I'm about to go home, and there's a moving van in front of the Stranahan Hall. And they're moving our desks out and their desks in. And I go up and say, what the hell is going on? And it was a law firm, Holland and Hart. And their vice president, who had a drinking problem, had leased the Physics Center to the Holland and Hart law firm on an airplane flight. And they took it seriously. They were moving in. Now, that actually made me hopping mad. And they did not move in. But it remained that issue about we never had a lease, couldn't get a lease. They put depreciation on their books, and the question is, did we put depreciation on our books? And it was just so confusing, and it never really got resolved till the Hadid issue divided the property up between music, physics, and institute.
And in connection with all of this, we started getting complaints from the Institute about Hilbert Hall, which had been there for the 2 years. And then we began getting constant questions. Are you going to move it this year? Finally, 1972, when we had our first NSF grant, we were really in good shape. In fact, Marcel Bardon came to our board meeting and said it was good stuff, encouraged us to submit another grant. We also had a letter from the Institute saying, you've got to get rid of the building by the end of the year. And if not, well, ... It was not clear what, but it was constant pressure to make changes.
That's curious, you know, because the Institute, I remember, after our summer study group, Fermilab summer study group, rented the part of Hilbert Hall one summer for a program on disarmament, because I remember Abe Shays was out, and we had a whole set of Institute people who were sort of commingling with us for one summer, probably 68, probably 70 or 71.
Herbert Bayer or someone didn't like the way it looked from across the way, and gradually the trees grew up around it, and it was less obvious, and the number of complaints decreased, but still.
It was always there.
Well, and in order to try to do some landscaping, hide Hilbert Hall from the Institute and from the Meadows area, various of us donated trees, we planted
It actually
them around.
worked.
It worked, yeah.
There's one other interaction sort of happening that we had during the 60s. Two members, I think they were actually on the Institute board at that time, Armand Bartos and John Powers, had the idea of having looked at the Physics Center, they thought, why not make Aspen a major place for artists in the summer? So they invited out at their expense, they created the Aspen Center for Contemporary Art. They rented the Brand building for the summer, made it available
Brought the op artists out.
studios.
Rosenzweig,
Yeah,
Indiana,
yeah,
Klaus Oldenburg.
that's right.
Oh, yeah.
And out they came, and we did have an afternoon with them talking about science and art, in which I think it was great fun. I'm not sure we talked to each other or past each other. They had about as strong feelings about what science might be as we had about what art might be. But it was an interesting time in the community, and that idea again got no support from the Institute, and it died. I think they went for 2 years, and that was it.